My son was about to receive the news that would transform his future, but then my windshield shattered into 1,000 fragments, each one reflecting a different version of my 67-year-old face. Where are you watching from today? Share your location below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Winds of Thought. Sirens wailed in the distance, racing toward what remained of my Lexus and the light pole that had leaped directly into my path. At least, that's the story I would tell when I got the opportunity. Let me rewind and explain how I ended up embracing a utility pole on Interstate 47 with $34 million in my financial accounts, and my son's contact information burning in my pocket. It all began 4 weeks earlier when my attorney called with information that would have knocked me over if I hadn't already been seated with a cup of tea that had turned cold 2 hours prior. Ms. Evelyn, Charles Bennett had stated in that cautious tone attorneys use when they're about to alter your reality forever. I'm calling regarding your great-aunt Beatrice's estate. Now, Aunt Beatrice had been 93 years old and more bitter than spoiled milk for the final 3 decades of her life. She'd resided alone in that massive mansion upstate, accumulating antique silverware and resentments in equal measure. The running family joke was that she'd outlast everyone through sheer malice. But apparently even malice has its boundaries, because she'd passed away quietly in her bed the week before New Year's. My condolences for your loss, Charles continued. But you must come to my office. There are substantial developments concerning her final wishes. The thing about receiving such a call at my age is you've learned to anticipate letdowns. Beatrice had never been particularly affectionate toward any of us, and she'd made it clear over the decades that she believed the Parker family lineage had yielded nothing but disappointing offshoots. So when I drove to Charles's office that freezing February morning, I expected to inherit perhaps a piece of Beatrice's crystal, or one of her sharp-tongued critiques from the afterlife. What I never anticipated was Charles sliding paperwork across his oak desk and observing my expression as I read the figures. $34 million. Properties across 4 states. Investment accounts that read like a directory of corporate America. All of it left to my beloved great-niece Evelyn, the only one who never expected anything from me. The irony wasn't lost on me. In a family of hands perpetually extended toward Beatrice's wealth, I'd been the solitary one who maintained my independence. And apparently, that had been precisely the correct approach. She left letters for every family member, Charles had clarified, producing an ivory envelope with my name written in Beatrice's delicate script. Yours is particularly comprehensive. I'd read that letter 4 times before the complete significance struck me. Beatrice had been observing all of us for years, taking notes, forming judgments, and she'd noticed things about my son, Daniel, that I'd been too much of a mother to acknowledge. Daniel has his father's charisma, and his great-uncle's avarice, she'd written. Evelyn, you raised him to anticipate the universe delivering everything on a silver tray. Now he's a 43-year-old man who still imagines achievement is something that occurs to other individuals. Don't permit him to squander what I've accumulated. That should have been my initial warning. But maternal myopia is an affliction that impacts women of every generation, and I was no exception. 4 weeks later, sitting in my vehicle outside Daniel's workplace with a folder containing financial documents that would revolutionize both our lives, I was still envisioning how impressed he'd be, how this would finally provide him the stability he'd been seeking. The final memory I had before the collision was Daniel's assistant informing me he was in a conference and couldn't be interrupted. I'd been merging back into traffic, picturing the expression on his face, when I shared the news, when a commercial van ran a stop sign and sent us both into a spiral that concluded with me intimately acquainted with an electrical pole. Now here I was 4 days later gazing at a medical facility ceiling with brown watermarks shaped like nations I'd never visited, listening to the constant beep of equipment that was apparently sustaining my existence. My right arm was immobilized. My head felt like it had been used for batting practice. And every time I inhaled, my ribs reminded me why abrupt halts were problematic for individuals my age. The most painful part wasn't the physical discomfort, though. The most painful part was that I'd contacted Daniel the instant I regained consciousness, and this is what he'd stated. Mom, I can't manage this sort of situation currently. I'm finalizing the most significant transaction of my professional life, and I can't abandon everything because you had a minor collision. A minor collision. That's how he characterized the accident that had left me appearing like I'd completed 12 rounds with a champion fighter. But here's the reality about reaching absolute bottom at 67. Sometimes it provides you the perfect vantage to see precisely what kind of foundation you've been constructing your existence upon. That was Wednesday. Today was Saturday, and Daniel still hadn't visited to confirm I was breathing. But I'd obtained something superior to a visit from my thankless son. I'd obtained clarity, and clarity at my age was more precious than all of Aunt Beatrice's millions. Well, nearly. The nursing staff here at Lakeside Medical have been attempting to uplift me by explaining how fortunate I am to be alive, which is precisely the type of false optimism I'd anticipate from individuals who spend their shifts watching other people expire. Fortunate, correct. Because nothing signals good luck like discovering your only child possesses the emotional complexity of a rain puddle and the faithfulness of a political pledge. I'd been Evelyn Parker, dedicated mother and widow for so long that I'd forgotten I used to be Evelyn Walsh, the young woman who'd negotiated her way into university with a partial scholarship and sufficient resolve to illuminate a small town. Somewhere along the journey, I'd exchanged my fortitude for a maternal intuition that had evidently been working double shifts for the previous 43 years. Let me tell you about Daniel. My pride and joy, my purpose for living, my greatest letdown packaged in a 6'1" frame with his father's hazel eyes and my determined jawline. He'd been the type of infant that made other women halt me in supermarket aisles to admire his flawless features, and I'd invested the subsequent 4 decades waiting for his character to match his appearance. Daniel completed university with a finance degree and sufficient student debt to purchase a condominium, then spent the following 21 years hopping between positions like someone with dedication problems and an imaginary trust fund. The complication was there existed no trust fund, merely a mother who kept rescuing him each time his newest wealth creation scheme imploded. There was the period he decided to become a property developer with zero capital and even less wisdom. 7 months later, I was writing a check to save him from financial ruin. Then arrived his hospitality phase because apparently watching culinary programs made him believe he comprehended the restaurant business. That catastrophe cost me my holiday savings and his marriage to a perfectly pleasant woman named Melissa, who prudently fled for safer territory. The sequence was always identical. Daniel would become enthusiastic about something novel, convince himself he was destined for magnificence, plunge in recklessly, and then call me when the waters grew too deep. And like the fool I was, I kept tossing him rescue devices instead of swimming instruction. Which brings me to Sophia Reynolds, the enigmatic woman who'd become Mrs. Daniel Parker 4 months earlier in what he characterized as an intimate, private ceremony that was so private it excluded his mother. I'd learned about the wedding through an Instagram post, which reveals everything you require to understand about our relationship these days. Sophia was 39 years old, worked in public relations, and possessed the type of smile that never completely reached her eyes in images. I'd encountered her exactly once at an uncomfortable dinner, where she'd spent the whole evening posing specific queries about my financial status while feigning interest in my gardening pastime. "Ms. Parker," she'd mentioned, leaning forward with that artificial grin. "Daniel mentions you're considering simplifying your living situation. That's so intelligent at your stage. Have you contemplated what you'll accomplish with all the value from your home? Now, I may be elderly, but I wasn't delivered yesterday." When a woman begins discussing your home equity during the initial meeting, she's not intrigued about becoming your daughter-in-law. She's intrigued about becoming your beneficiary. But I'd remained silent because Daniel had appeared content. And after Melissa had departed from him, I'd been concerned he'd wind up solitary. Now, lying here with machines beeping my vital signs to a vacant room, I was starting to believe solitary might have been preferable. Where are you watching from today? Share your location below and don't forget to like and subscribe to Winds of Thought. The door opened and Dr. Amanda Chen entered with the type of purposeful gait that indicated she had updates that wouldn't improve my day. "Ms. Parker, how are you feeling today?" "Like I've been struck by a bus, which is ironic since it was actually a van that struck me." She smiled at that. The kind of authentic smile that revealed she valued a patient who wasn't drowning in self-pity. "Your MRI results are available. The positive information is there's no additional neurological impairment beyond what we originally identified. The challenging information is you'll remain here for at minimum another week, while we observe your healing. Another week in this location. Another week of Daniel having every chance to visit and selecting not to. Another week of Sophia Reynolds pretending she cared about my welfare while computing how long she'd need to wait for me to expire naturally. "Doctor, may I ask you something?" "Certainly. In your professional opinion, how frequently do grown children actually visit their parents in medical facilities?" Dr. Chen settled into the plastic seat beside my bed, which indicated she was preparing for a discussion, not a brief medical update. "Are we discussing your son?" "We're discussing family relationships and whether I've been deceiving myself for the previous 4 decades. She was silent for an instant, selecting her phrasing deliberately. Ms. Parker, I witnessed numerous families during emergency circumstances. What I've discovered is that crises don't generate character defects, they expose them. That struck me like a second vehicle impact. So you're suggesting Daniel has always been self-centered, and I've simply been creating justifications for him. I'm suggesting that individuals reveal their true nature when the consequences are most significant. The question isn't whether Daniel should be present here. The question is what you'll accomplish with the understanding his absence is providing you. After she departed, I retrieved my phone and stared at Daniel's contact details. I could call him again. I could shame him into visiting. I could play the dying mother card until he appeared with floral arrangements and apologies, or I could acknowledge that Dr. Chen was correct, and this was who my son truly was when nobody was compelling him to pretend otherwise. That's when I noticed something I'd overlooked previously. 4 missed calls from an unfamiliar number, and a voice message that had arrived while I was undergoing my MRI. I replayed it, and a woman's voice filled the compact space. Ms. Parker, this is Rebecca Miller from Lakeside Trust and Estate Management. I'm calling regarding the inheritance paperwork you were transporting during your incident. They were retrieved from your automobile, and there are some inconsistencies that require your prompt consideration. Please contact me at your earliest convenience. Inconsistencies. That was never terminology you desired to hear from someone managing millions of your dollars. But it was about to become considerably more irregular because I was about to discover precisely how far my son was prepared to proceed to access Aunt Beatrice's fortune. Rebecca Miller possessed the type of voice that implied she'd spent her career delivering unfavorable updates to individuals who believed they were having favorable days. When I returned her call from my medical bed, she went directly to the point in a manner I was starting to appreciate from the professional women in my life. Ms. Parker, I need to pose some delicate queries regarding your family circumstances. Proceed ahead. At this stage, delicate is relative. Have you informed anyone about your inheritance? The query struck me like frozen water. Only my son. I was literally en route to inform him when the incident occurred. Why? Silence on the opposite end of the line that continued long enough to make my heart monitor begin beeping more rapidly. Ms. Parker, someone has been making inquiries regarding your great-aunt's estate. Specifically, they've been questioning the probate schedule and when the funds would become accessible for allocation. My mouth became dry. What type of inquiries? The type that implies someone is deeply interested in your financial status and has been conducting investigation. I wouldn't typically be alarmed, but the inquiry commenced for weeks before your aunt's passing was even announced in the death notices. I shut my eyes and attempted to process what she was telling me. Someone had known about Beatrice's death and her testament before I did. Someone had been preparing for this inheritance before Beatrice was even interred. Ms. Parker, I dislike posing this, but have you recently modified any insurance policies, wills, or beneficiary information? The room started rotating, and it had nothing to do with my head injury. No, I haven't altered anything in years. My son remains my primary beneficiary on everything. I believe you need to contemplate making some modifications. Promptly. After I disconnected, I sat there staring at the water-stained ceiling and attempting to determine how my existence had become the type of family melodrama they created television films about. Either I was becoming paranoid or my son and his new spouse had been preparing their inheritance approach before I even knew there was an inheritance to prepare for. The knock on my door interrupted my descent into maternal disappointment. A youthful nurse I hadn't encountered previously peered inside. She was possibly 32 with chestnut hair pulled back in a ponytail, and the type of bright eyes that suggested she genuinely enjoyed her occupation. Ms. Parker, I'm Jessica, and I'll be covering for Michelle this weekend. How are you feeling? Like I'm existing in a soap opera where I'm the only character who doesn't comprehend the storyline. Jessica laughed. A genuine laugh that made me appreciate her instantly. That sounds about accurate for a Saturday afternoon in the medical facility. Mind if I check your vitals? As she worked, I found myself examining her face. There was something recognizable about her features, something that tugged at the edge of my memory like a term on the tip of your tongue. Jessica, have we met previously? You appear familiar. She paused in measuring my blood pressure, and I detected a flicker of something in her expression. Recognition. Anxiety. I don't believe so, Ms. Parker, I just commenced working here this week. What motivated you to select nursing? My grandmother was a nurse. She always stated it was the type of profession where you could create a genuine difference in people's lives. She completed with the blood pressure monitor and made notations on my chart. She used to share anecdotes about her patients, how occasionally the families were more challenging to manage than the medical issues. Something in her tone made me observe her more attentively. What type of family complications? Jessica settled into the seat Dr. Chen had vacated earlier, which appeared to be becoming the unofficial confession corner of room 412. Grown children who only appear when they believe there's money involved. Families who conflict over inheritances before the patient has even departed. Individuals who utilize medical emergencies as possibilities instead of reality checks. I was starting to comprehend why she appeared familiar. Not because I'd encountered her previously, but because she wore the same expression I'd been displaying since Wednesday, the appearance of someone who determined that the people closest to them weren't quite who they'd pretended to be. Jessica, may I ask you something personal? Certainly. Have you ever needed to select between what you desire to believe about someone and what the evidence is telling you? She was quiet for an extended moment. And when she responded, her voice was gentle. Regularly, Ms. Parker. Every single day. After she departed, I contacted Charles Bennett, my attorney, and requested him to visit the medical facility. If Rebecca Miller was correct and someone had been making inquiries about Beatrice's estate before her death was public, I required to know precisely what type of legal security I possessed. More significantly, I required to know what type of legal vulnerability Daniel might have generated for himself. Charles arrived 3 hours later with his customary leather briefcase, and his concerned expression that indicated he'd been conducting research since my call. Evelyn, we need to discuss some matters that might be difficult to hear. Charles. At this point, difficult is my middle name. Provide me with your most severe. He produced a folder and placed it on the medical table. I've been investigating the inquiries about Beatrice's estate. They originated from a legal practice in the metropolitan area that focuses on estate planning and asset security. Asset security from what? From creditors, from tax responsibilities, from family conflicts. He opened the folder and showed me a professional card. The lawyer who made the inquiries is named Robert Coleman. Does that name signify anything to you? I examined the card and my blood pressure started ascending again. Robert Coleman. Coleman and Partners. Estate planning and asset security. I'd never encountered the name previously, but I'd heard the legal practice referenced recently. Charles. Daniel mentioned he was collaborating with a new attorney regarding some business undertaking. He stated the lawyer specialized in investment security. Evelyn. Robert Coleman doesn't handle commercial law. He handles family wealth management and inheritance disputes. His specialty is assisting individuals maximize their inheritance potential and minimize their tax exposure. The fragments started clicking into position like a jigsaw puzzle assembled by someone with exceptionally steady hands and highly questionable ethics. Daniel hadn't been preparing a business undertaking. He'd been preparing for my death, and he'd employed an attorney to guarantee he obtained every cent of Beatrice's $34 million. But here's the reality about being 67 years old and reclining in a medical bed while your only child schemes your financial downfall. It provides you a distinctive perspective on what genuinely matters in existence. And what mattered to me currently wasn't the money or even the treachery. What mattered was that I was about to demonstrate my son precisely what occurred when you misinterpret your mother for a stepping stone. Because if Daniel believed he could inherit Beatrice's fortune by wishing me into an early grave, he was about to learn that the Parker family tree had yielded at minimum one branch with more combat than he'd anticipated. But initially, I was going to discover precisely who else was involved in this minor conspiracy, commencing with his new spouse, and her highly convenient marriage to a man whose mother had just become inconveniently wealthy. Sometimes the people closest to us are the most dangerous strangers. Sunday morning delivered coffee that tasted like someone had dissolved footwear in heated water, and a visit from Sophia Reynolds Parker that I definitely hadn't requested. She glided into my room wearing a charcoal dress that whispered funeral appropriate and carrying blossoms that were likely from the medical facility gift shop downstairs. The smile she'd painted on her face was the identical one she'd worn to our awkward dinner, but this occasion I was observing it with fresh vision. Evelyn, you poor dear. Daniel has been absolutely distraught with concern. That was intriguing considering Daniel had been too distraught to actually visit, return calls, or apparently noticed that his mother had been in the medical facility for 6 days. But I'd learned something crucial about managing individuals like Sophia. Occasionally the optimal strategy was to permit them to hang themselves with their own rope. Sophia, how considerate of you to come. Daniel couldn't attend. Oh, you comprehend how he is when he's engaged in something substantial. He's been practically residing at the workplace attempting to organize everything. She organized the blossoms in a plastic container with the efficiency of someone who'd accomplished this previously. He requested me to check on you and observe how you're recuperating. How I'm recuperating from what precisely? The query appeared to startle her. From your incident. Daniel informed you about the incident. Well, yes, naturally he did. When it occurred. I nodded gradually because Sophia had just disclosed something she probably hadn't intended to. According to Daniel, he couldn't manage this sort of situation when I had contacted him from the medical facility, but apparently he'd had sufficient time to provide Sophia a detailed briefing about my condition. Sophia, settle down. Let's converse. She perched on the edge of the visitor seat like a woman prepared to make a rapid departure if necessary. How are you feeling? You appear significantly improved than I anticipated. I'm feeling thankful, actually. There's nothing comparable to a near-death encounter to assist you perceive individuals clearly. I'm so pleased you're remaining optimistic. Daniel was concerned you might be despondent or anxious about the future. What future would that be? Another flash of uncertainty in those calculating eyes. Your recovery, your health, you comprehend, normal worries for someone your stage after a trauma like this. Someone my stage. There it was again, that subtle reminder that I was elderly, fragile, and presumably one step from the grave. Sophia was operating from the identical playbook as Daniel, but she wasn't nearly as proficient at concealing her genuine intentions. Sophia, inform me about your family. I realize I know almost nothing about your background. The smile wavered for merely an instant. Oh, you comprehend, typical American family. Nothing too fascinating. Where did you mature? Indiana. Small community. You probably wouldn't recognize it. Attempt me. Riverside. It's merely a minor agricultural settlement. I filed that information for subsequent verification because something in Sophia's voice suggested she was inventing her childhood spontaneously, but I was more intrigued by her present circumstances. How did you and Daniel encounter each other? At an industry conference. He was there representing his organization, and I was there for public relations workshops. We simply connected immediately. Which conference was that? It was a wealth management conference for independent business proprietors. That was intriguing considering Daniel had never possessed a business, independent or otherwise. And according to the narrative he told me, they'd encountered each other at a cafe near his workplace. Sophia was either a habitual liar, or she was having difficulty tracking which edition of their romance narrative she'd shared with whom. Sophia, may I ask you something personal? Certainly. What are your intentions now that you're married? Are you contemplating children, purchasing a residence, that sort of thing? The query appeared to relax her, as if we'd transitioned into safer territory. Oh, well, Daniel and I have discussed all of that. We'd adore to have a family, but we want to guarantee we're financially stable initially. You comprehend how costly everything is currently. Absolutely. Financial stability is so crucial. Have you two been preparing for the future? Investments, life insurance, that type of thing. Daniel has been collaborating with a financial consultant about investment approaches. He's highly concentrated on constructing prosperity for our future family. That's marvelous. What type of investments? Sophia shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I don't genuinely comprehend all the particulars. Daniel manages the financial aspect of things. Naturally he did. Because in Sophia's world, the little woman abandoned the monetary matters to her husband, particularly when those monetary matters involved inheriting millions from his mother. Well, I'm certain Daniel is making intelligent decisions. He's always been skilled with money. That was a falsehood so spectacular that I nearly choked on it, but Sophia nodded enthusiastically, apparently unaware that Daniel's financial history resembled a controlled demolition more than strategic preparation. A new voice interrupted our discussion. Pardon me, Ms. Parker. We both rotated to observe Jessica standing in the doorway with her clipboard, and that recognizable expression I was starting to identify as carefully controlled tension. I apologize for interrupting, but I need to examine your bandages. Sophia stood up instantly, gathering her purse with the rapid movements of someone eager to escape. I should depart regardless. Daniel will desire to know how you're progressing. Sophia, before you depart, could you inform Daniel I need to speak with him? It's crucial. Certainly, I'll inform him. After Sophia departed, Jessica shut the door and rotated to me with an expression that was considerably more serious than any medical process required. Miss Parker, I hope you don't object to me stating this, but you should be cautious around that woman. Why do you mention that? Jessica looked toward the door as if confirming Sophia was genuinely gone. Because I've observed her here previously, and it wasn't to visit you. My heart started performing that irregular beating activity that makes medical monitors become erratic. What do you imply? 4 days ago, she was at the nursing station posing highly specific queries about your condition, your treatment strategy, and your anticipated duration of stay. But when we requested her to register in the visitor log, she stated she'd reconsidered and departed. So Sophia had been monitoring me since the commencement, gathering intelligence for Daniel while pretending to be the concerned daughter-in-law. It was beginning to appear like my incident had activated some type of coordinated response from the joyful couple. Jessica, is there something else? Ms. Parker, I probably shouldn't share this, but yesterday I overheard her on the telephone in the parking area. She was conversing with someone about schedule expectations and alternative situations if the recovery requires longer than projected. Alternative situations. That was a euphemism that made my blood run cold because I was starting to comprehend that Sophia and Daniel weren't merely waiting for me to expire naturally. They were creating contingency plans in case I required too long to accommodate their inheritance schedule, but they'd committed one critical error. They'd underestimated the woman they were attempting to manipulate. And they were about to discover that surviving 67 years on this planet had instructed me a few things about identifying predators. The query currently wasn't whether Daniel and Sophia were preparing something. The query was how far they were prepared to proceed, and how much evidence I could accumulate before they determined that their target was counterattacking. By Monday morning, I'd made a decision that would have shocked the previous Evelyn Parker, but felt completely natural to the new edition of myself that was emerging from the wreckage of my maternal illusions. I was going to investigate my own son and his spouse like the potential criminals they were apparently becoming. The initial step was contacting Detective Lisa Washington, a woman I'd encountered at a community security assembly last year, who'd impressed me with her no-nonsense method to elder exploitation. When I clarified my situation, she didn't dismiss my concerns as the paranoid fantasies of a traumatized incident victim. Ms. Parker, what you're describing matches a design we observe more frequently than individuals recognize. Grown children who marry rapidly after a parent obtains an inheritance, mysterious inquiries about estates, sudden interest in a parent's medical condition. These are warning signs. What type of warning signs? The type that suggests someone is preparing to accelerate their inheritance timeline. That phrase struck me like a physical blow. Are you suggesting you believe Daniel and Sophia might be preparing to harm me? I am suggesting that when substantial quantities of money are involved, individuals occasionally contemplate options they wouldn't typically consider, particularly if they believe they can make it appear accidental. After I disconnected, I sat there staring at my reflection in the medical facility window and attempting to process the reality that I was now officially concerned that my own son might be planning my murder. It was the type of realization that should have sent me into hysterical tears. But instead, I found myself becoming furious. The type of cold, calculated fury that originates from finally perceiving the truth about someone you've been creating justifications for your entire existence. That's when Jessica materialized in my doorway with what looked suspiciously like excitement in her eyes. Ms. Parker, may I converse with you about something? Jessica, at this point, you may converse with me about anything. Proceed ahead. She closed the door and moved her seat nearer to my bed. I've been contemplating what you mentioned yesterday, about needing to select between what you desire to believe about someone and what the evidence informs you. Yes. The reality is, I haven't been completely truthful with you about why I appear familiar. My heart started performing that irregular activity again, but this occasion it felt like anticipation rather than dread. I did identify you when I initially observed you, Ms. Parker. Not because we'd encountered each other, but because I'd observed your image previously. Where? In Sophia Reynolds's apartment. The room became completely silent except for the steady beeping of my monitors. Jessica had just confirmed that my suspicions about Sophia weren't paranoid delusions. They were justified. Jessica, I believe you'd better clarify everything. She inhaled deeply like someone about to plunge into profound water. My name is Jessica Miller, and Sophia Reynolds isn't who she claims to be. Her genuine name is Sophia Coleman, and she's been preparing this marriage to your son for over 14 months. The world tilted sideways. Sophia Coleman, as in Robert Coleman, the lawyer who was making inquiries about Beatrice's estate. Robert Coleman is her sibling. If I hadn't already been reclining in a medical bed, I would have required one. The fragments of the puzzle weren't merely clicking into position. They were colliding like freight trains. Sophia wasn't some random woman Daniel had encountered at a cafe or an industry conference. She was portion of a coordinated plan involving her attorney sibling, and what was beginning to appear like a professional inheritance scheme. Jessica, how do you comprehend all this? Because I previously dated Robert Coleman, and I've spent the previous 8 months observing him ruin people's lives for money. Sophia is his sibling, but she's also his business collaborator. They specialize in targeting wealthy older adults through their grown children. How does it function? Sophia identifies targets through public documentation, recent inheritances, property transfers, estate probates. Then she organizes to encounter the heir, typically through some manufactured coincidence. She's charming, appealing, and she relocates rapidly. Most men don't realize what's occurring until it's too delayed. I contemplated Daniel with his history of poor decisions, and his desperate requirement to feel successful. He would have been perfect prey for someone like Sophia. What's the final objective? Jessica's expression darkened. Typically, the marriage continues merely long enough to establish inheritance privileges, and then the wealthy parent dies in an incident that appears natural. Cardiac arrest, fall, medication error, things that occur to older adults regularly. And Robert Coleman manages the legal aspect. He guarantees the wills are structured appropriately, that the inheritances transfer rapidly, and that there are no legal complications. He's highly proficient at what he accomplishes. The complete scope of what I was managing struck me like a second Van impact. This wasn't merely a greedy son and his calculating spouse. This was a professional operation, and I was their newest target. Jessica, why are you informing me this? Because Robert Coleman destroyed my aunt's family last year. Identical design, identical techniques, but they committed an error with your family. What error? They didn't investigate you thoroughly enough. They presumed you'd resemble their other targets, isolated, trusting, financially naive. But you're not, and you've been posing the correct queries. I observed this youthful woman who'd risked her occupation and possibly her security to caution me, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Genuine gratitude for an unexpected partnership. Jessica, what do you require me to accomplish? Assist me accumulate evidence. My aunt's family never had verification of what Robert and Sophia were preparing, so they escaped consequences. But if we can document their design, construct a case, we might be able to halt them and rescue the subsequent family, and rescue your existence. That afternoon, when Sophia returned for her second concerned daughter-in-law visit, I was prepared for her. She brought additional blossoms, additional artificial smiles, and a carefully rehearsed concern for my emotional condition. Evelyn, Daniel is so concerned about you. He believes you might be despondent about the future. Have you contemplated what you'll accomplish when you depart from here? Actually, Sophia, I've been contemplating making some modifications. The incident genuinely placed things in perspective for me. Her eyes brightened with what I now identified as predatory interest. What type of modifications? Well, I've been contemplating my will, my insurance policies, things like that. You comprehend how they mention you should organize your affairs after a medical scare. That's highly wise. Evelyn, have you conversed with an attorney? I was contemplating it. Do you know anyone competent? Someone who comprehends estate planning. Sophia's smile became more genuine, which was precisely what I'd hoped for. Actually, Daniel has been collaborating with someone exceptional, Robert Coleman. He's fantastic with family financial preparation. That sounds ideal. Perhaps I should organize a meeting with him. I believe that's a wonderful concept. I'll have Daniel contact him today. After she departed, I contacted Jessica and informed her about the discussion. Within an hour, we'd established a strategy that would either expose Sophia and Robert Coleman for the criminals they were or get me killed in the procedure. But here's the reality about being a 67-year-old woman who's just discovered that her family tree includes a branch of sociopaths. Occasionally the only path forward is through, even when through leads directly into the core of a conspiracy created to make you vanish. Robert Coleman possessed the type of workplace that shrieked expensive achievement, leather seating, mahogany workstation, and legal volumes that appeared like they'd never been opened but cost a fortune to exhibit. When Daniel escorted me in for our appointment Thursday morning, I was utilizing a walking aid and performing the part of a fragile elderly woman who required guidance from powerful, intelligent men. Mom, I believe you're genuinely going to appreciate Robert. He's assisted Sophia and me plan our complete financial future. Robert Coleman was younger than I'd anticipated, possibly 42, with the type of polished confidence that originates from years of convincing individuals to trust him with their life savings. He stood when we entered, all professional courtesy and practiced appeal. Ms. Parker, it's such a pleasure to encounter you. Daniel has informed me so much about you, and I was so apologetic to learn about your incident. Thank you, Robert. Daniel mentions you're wonderful at assisting families secure their wealth. That's precisely what I accomplish. I assist individuals guarantee that their legacy is preserved and their loved ones are cared for according to their desires. I settled into the leather seat across from his workstation. Gripping my walking aid with hands, I made certain to tremble marginally. I must confess, this inheritance has me feeling overwhelmed. $34 million is more money than I ever envisioned possessing. Robert's eyes illuminated like a man who'd just observed his annual bonus walking through the doorway. It's certainly a considerable amount, but with appropriate preparation, we can guarantee that it provides security for you and your family for generations. What type of preparation? Well, initially we need to examine tax implications. Inheritances of that magnitude can be subject to significant estate taxes if they're not structured appropriately. He produced a legal pad and started making notations. How has the money been invested currently? I provided him the details I'd memorized from Beatrice's financial statements, observing him compute percentages in his mind. Daniel sat beside me, nodding along like a man who comprehended investment strategy, instead of someone whose longest relationship with money had continued approximately 7 months. Ms. Parker, I'd recommend establishing a family trust that would secure these assets from taxes and potential creditors. We'd structure it so that you maintain authority during your lifetime, but the assets transfer seamlessly to Daniel upon your death. That sounds complicated. Not at all. I specialize in these arrangements. In fact, I've already prepared some preliminary documentation based on what Daniel informed me about your situation. He reached into his workstation drawer and produced a folder dense with legal papers. These are merely drafts, naturally, but they'll provide you in concept of how we can structure everything. I accepted the papers with the grateful smile of a woman who was relieved to have someone else manage the confusing particulars. But as I browsed through the pages, I was actually reading attentively, searching for precisely what Jessica had cautioned me to anticipate. And there it was, concealed in the legal terminology like an explosive device in a flower garden. The trust documentation wasn't merely created to transfer assets to Daniel upon my death. They were structured to make him the immediate beneficiary if I became incapacitated due to medical or psychological health issues. Robert, what does this segment imply? I indicated the relevant paragraph, permitting my voice to carry merely a hint of confusion. Oh, that's merely a standard provision to secure you if you ever develop dementia or become unable to manage your affairs. It guarantees that Daniel can intervene instantly to secure your interests. Secure my interests. Correct. What it actually implied was that if I had another incident, or developed convenient health complications, or started displaying indications of mental deterioration, Daniel would gain instant access to $34 million without the inconvenience of waiting for me to expire naturally. How would that be established? The incapacity, I imply. Typically by medical assessment. If 2 physicians concur that you're no longer competent to make financial decisions, the trust provisions would activate automatically. 2 physicians, like the type of physicians who might be prepared to diagnose convenient medical conditions in exchange for financial compensation from someone who'd recently gained access to millions of dollars. This all appears highly thorough, Robert. When would we need to finalize everything? I'd recommend relocating rapidly. Estate preparation is most effective when it's implemented before any health complications emerge. I could have final documentation prepared by Monday if you're comfortable proceeding. Daniel leaned forward eagerly. Mom, I genuinely believe this is the correct action to take. It'll provide you peace of mind knowing everything is organized. Peace of mind from a son who hadn't visited me in the medical facility, and a lawyer who was preparing to assist him steal my inheritance by having me declared incompetent. You comprehend what? I believe I'd prefer to proceed, but I do have one request. Certainly, Ms. Parker. Anything. I'd prefer my longtime attorney to examine everything before I endorse. Charles Bennett has been managing my affairs for 21 years, and I trust his judgment completely. Robert's smile flickered for merely an instant, like a candle in an abrupt gust. Certainly, that's perfectly reasonable, though I should mention that occasionally external attorneys can complicate straightforward transactions with unnecessary concerns. I'm certain Charles will comprehend that you're looking out for my optimal interests. After we departed Robert's workplace, Daniel drove me back to my residence, the initial occasion I'd been home since the incident. As we approached the driveway, I observed an automobile parked across the roadway that hadn't been there previously. A dark sedan with tinted windows and someone seated in the driver's position. Daniel, do you comprehend who that is? He barely glanced at the automobile. Probably merely someone visiting the neighbors. Are you certain you're prepared to be home solitary? Sophia and I could remain with you for a few days. That's thoughtful, but I'll be adequate. What I didn't inform Daniel was that I wouldn't be solitary. Jessica had organized for Detective Washington to have patrol vehicles drive by regularly, and Charles Bennett was arriving that evening to examine Robert Coleman's trust documentation. By tomorrow morning, we'd comprehend precisely what type of legal trap I was being guided into. But as Daniel assisted me into the residence, and I observed him glance around with the calculating eyes of someone making an inventory, I realized that the legal documentation was merely one portion of the plan. Daniel and Sophia weren't merely attempting to steal my money. They were attempting to isolate me, control my environment, and generate the ideal circumstances for my convenient disappearance. The dark sedan was still parked across the roadway when Daniel departed an hour later. But what Daniel didn't comprehend was that Detective Washington was seated 3 residences down in an unmarked automobile taking photographs of everyone who came and went from my property. Because if the Coleman siblings believed they were going to murder me for Beatrice's inheritance, they were about to discover that this specific elderly woman had some highly unexpected partners, and we were all highly intrigued in remaining alive long enough to observe them apprehended. Charles Bennett arrived at 7 o'clock precisely with his reading spectacles, and his grim expression that indicated Robert Coleman's trust documentation were every bit as problematic as I'd suspected. We distributed the papers across my dining room table like evidence at a criminal scene, which is essentially what they were. Evelyn, this isn't estate preparation. This is legalized robbery with a murder clause included for good measure. Provide me the particulars. The trust is structured so that Daniel gains instant authority of all assets. If you're declared incapacitated by any 2 licensed physicians, there's no necessity for independent assessment, no appeals procedure, and no supervision once he assumes authority. Implying if Daniel can locate 2 physicians prepared to state you're mentally incompetent, he obtains $34 million while you're still inhaling. I contemplated Robert Coleman's polished confidence, about Sophia's cautious queries regarding my recovery schedule, and about the dark sedan that had been parked across the roadway for 4 hours. Charles, is this legal? Unfortunately, yes. It's unethical, predatory, and morally reprehensible, but it's perfectly legal if you endorse it voluntarily. My telephone rang, and Daniel's name materialized on the display. I glanced at Charles, who nodded and produced a compact recording apparatus. Hi, Daniel. Mom, how are you feeling? Sophia and I have been concerned about you being solitary so promptly after the incident. I'm managing adequate. A little exhausted but adequate. That's actually why I'm contacting. Sophia believes you appeared disoriented this afternoon at Robert's workplace. You were posing the identical queries repeatedly and appeared to have difficulty tracking the discussion. My blood pressure started ascending. I don't recall being disoriented. Mom, it's nothing to be humiliated about. Head injuries can impact memory and cognitive performance. Sophia believes you should visit Dr. Harrison tomorrow for a neurological assessment. Dr. Harrison, a name I'd never encountered previously, recommended by Sophia Reynolds Coleman, who happened to be the sibling of the lawyer who required 2 physicians to declare me incompetent. Daniel, I value your concern, but Dr. Chen is managing my medical treatment, and she mentions I'm recuperating well. Mom, Dr. Chen is a trauma doctor. Dr. Harrison specializes in brain injuries and cognitive evaluation. Sophia organized an appointment for you at 10 tomorrow morning. Sophia had organized me a medical appointment without my awareness or consent. That was either incredibly presumptuous or the initial maneuver in a strategy to have me declared mentally incompetent by Monday. Daniel, I need to contemplate this. Mom, there's nothing to contemplate. Sophia and I are merely looking out for your welfare. We'll collect you at 9:30. After I disconnected, Charles observed me with the expression of someone who just observed a chess master reveal their strategy. Evelyn, they're relocating faster than I anticipated. If Dr. Harrison diagnoses you with cognitive impairment tomorrow, they can file to have you declared incompetent by Monday. Daniel could have legal access to your inheritance by Tuesday. That evening, I organized an emergency meeting with Jessica and Detective Washington. They came to my residence after dark utilizing the rear entrance to avoid the surveillance I was now certain was being conducted by the Coleman operation. Ms. Parker, we've identified the individual in the sedan, Detective Washington stated, settling into my living room with her notebook. His name is Marcus Johnson, and he's a private investigator who's been employed to document your daily activities and psychological condition. By whom? Officially, by a legal practice that specializes in competency hearings. Unofficially by Robert Coleman. Jessica leaned forward with the intensity of someone who'd been waiting months for this discussion. They're constructing a case file to support Dr. Harrison's diagnosis. Photographs of you appearing confused, testimony about unpredictable conduct, evidence that you're unable to care for yourself securely. What type of evidence? They'll allege you're neglecting to eat, abandoning appliances activated, becoming disoriented in familiar locations, all indications of cognitive decline that would validate emergency intervention. Detective Washington opened her folder and showed me a surveillance photograph taken through my kitchen window. It displayed me standing at the stove this afternoon, appearing confused and concerned. This was captured while you were preparing dinner. To someone who doesn't comprehend better, it appears like a woman who's forgotten why she's in the kitchen. But I was actually following Charles's recipe for pasta sauce and attempting to decipher his handwriting. Exactly. But context is everything, and they're controlling the context. Jessica produced her own folder dense with documentation and photographs. I've been accumulating evidence about Robert and Sophia's previous targets. There have been at minimum 7 instances in the previous 4 years that follow this precise design. What occurred to the targets? 4 were declared incompetent and died within 7 months of mysterious medical complications. 2 committed suicide after losing authority of their assets. 1 vanished completely. Her remains were never located. The room became quiet as the complete scope of what I was managing sank in. This wasn't merely a greedy son and his manipulative spouse. This was a professional operation that had murdered at minimum 7 individuals for their inheritance money. Detective Washington, why haven't they been apprehended? Because they're highly proficient at what they accomplish. They select targets carefully, isolated older adults with substantial estates and children who are desperate for money. By the time the design becomes evident, the targets are either deceased or legally powerless to counterattack. What makes you believe this occasion will be different? Because you requested assistance before you endorsed the trust documentation. And because we have Jessica's internal information about their techniques. She leaned forward with the type of intensity that indicated we were approaching the crucial portion of the strategy. Ms. Parker, we want to provide you the opportunity to operate undercover. Undercover. Wear a recording apparatus to tomorrow's medical appointment. Permit Dr. Harrison to evaluate you, but document everything he states and accomplishes. If we can demonstrate that he's been coached to diagnose you with cognitive impairment, regardless of your actual condition, we can construct a case for conspiracy and fraud. Jessica added, I'll be working at the medical workplace tomorrow as a temporary nurse. I can provide backup documentation and witness testimony. I observed these 2 women who were requesting me to risk my existence to halt a family of killers. And I realized that this was precisely the type of choice that defined who you genuinely were when everything was at stake. What are the risks? If they determine what we're accomplishing, they might accelerate their schedule, Detective Washington stated honestly. Instead of waiting for a competency hearing, they might organize an incident. And if we accomplish nothing, you'll be declared incompetent by Monday, and you'll be deceased within 7 months. I contemplated Beatrice's letter, about her caution that Daniel had his great-uncle's greed, about her hope that I would secure what she'd constructed. I contemplated the other targets who died solitary and powerless while their families celebrated unexpected windfalls. But mostly, I contemplated the reality that I was 67 years old and exhausted of being underestimated by individuals who believed maternal affection made me foolish. Detective Washington, when do we commence? Thursday night. I barely rested. Every creak of the residence settling, every automobile passing on the roadway, every shadow moving past my bedroom window felt like the opening note of my murder. By morning, I'd consumed adequate coffee to power a minor metropolis, and had examined the recording apparatus Jessica had provided me at minimum 60 times. At 9:30 precisely, Daniel and Sophia arrived to transport me to my appointment with Dr. Harrison. Sophia was attired like a concerned daughter-in-law in a burgundy dress that suggested both respectability and mourning, while Daniel wore the type of false concern that performers utilize in community theater productions. "Mom, you appear exhausted. Did you rest well?" Daniel inquired as he assisted me into their automobile. "Approximately as well as anyone can rest when they're concerned about their psychological health." Sophia rotated from the passenger seat, with what I was now trained to identify as calculated sympathy. "Evelyn, there's nothing to concern yourself about. Dr. Harrison is merely going to accomplish some straightforward examinations to guarantee the incident didn't impact your cognitive performance." "What type of examinations?" "Memory activities, fundamental problem resolution, queries about current happenings, merely routine evaluation after a head injury." The medical workplace was situated in a professional structure that appeared expensive and legitimate. Precisely the type of location where you'd trust a physician to inform you the truth about your psychological condition. Dr. Harrison himself was a distinguished-looking man in his 50s with silver hair, and the type of bedside approach that probably reassured families immediately before he destroyed their lives. "Ms. Parker, please have a seat. I comprehend you've recently encountered a significant automotive incident." "Yes, approximately 3 weeks ago. And you've been encountering some disorientation, memory complications, difficulty tracking discussions." I glanced at Sophia, who was seated in the corner taking notations like a devoted family member documenting my deterioration. "I haven't observed any significant complications." "Well, that's actually quite typical with traumatic brain injuries. Frequently, the patient isn't conscious of their cognitive deficiencies. That's why family members like Sophia are so crucial in these evaluations." He invested the subsequent 35 minutes placing me through what appeared to be legitimate cognitive testing, remembering term lists, resolving straightforward mathematics issues, identifying images and forms. I performed normally on every examination while the recording apparatus Jessica had concealed in my purse documented everything. "Ms. Parker, permit me to inquire about your daily schedule. Are you managing your household duties effectively? Cooking, cleaning, settling invoices?" "I believe so." "Yes." Dr. Harrison made notations on his chart, then observed Sophia with what appeared like significance. "Sophia, have you observed any modifications in Evelyn's capability to manage daily obligations?" And here it arrived, the family testimony that would validate his predetermined diagnosis. "Actually, yes," Sophia stated with the ideal combination of sorrow and concern. "Yesterday, when we visited her residence, the stove was abandoned activated with no container or pan on it. There were invoices distributed around the dining room table like she'd commenced settling them, but forgot what she was accomplishing. And she requested Daniel the identical query about her appointment time for different occasions. Every term was a falsehood. But Dr. Harrison was transcribing it all as if Sophia were a credible witness instead of a professional predator. Has she displayed any indications of paranoid reasoning or unusual suspicions about family members? Sophia and Daniel exchanged meaningful glances. She's been making some peculiar allegations about individuals observing her residence and questioning our motives for assisting her with financial preparation. Daniel stated. That's quite typical with cognitive decline. Patients frequently develop paranoid ideation and become suspicious of the people nearest to them. Dr. Harrison rotated back to me with the type of gentle authority that probably made families feel grateful for his expertise. Ms. Parker, I'm going to recommend some additional testing. Nothing invasive, merely some brain scans to assist us comprehend how the incident has impacted your cognitive performance. Is that essential? I'm concerned it is. Based on my examination and your family's observations, I'm perceiving indications of traumatic brain injury with associated cognitive impairment. We need to establish the extent of the impairment so we can discuss appropriate care alternatives. Appropriate care alternatives. That was medical terminology for having me declared incompetent and placing me under Daniel's financial authority. What type of care alternatives? Well, that would depend on the examination outcomes. But given what I'm perceiving today, I believe we need to contemplate whether you're still capable of making crucial decisions independently. Sophia leaned forward with her concerned daughter-in-law expression. Dr. Harrison, Evelyn has significant financial obligations that she might not be able to manage securely in her current condition. That's precisely the type of situation where family intervention becomes essential. Dr. Harrison concurred. We can't permit someone with cognitive impairment to make financial decisions that could be detrimental to themselves or their loved ones. After the appointment, as Daniel drove me home, I listened to them discuss my future as if I weren't seated 3 feet away. Dr. Harrison appears highly knowledgeable, Sophia stated. What did you contemplate about his recommendations? I believe Mom requires more assistance than she's prepared to acknowledge, Daniel responded. The brain scans will provide us the documentation we require to advance with Robert's trust arrangement. Documentation they required. Not medical treatment that I required, but legal evidence they could utilize to steal $34 million. When can we schedule the brain scans? Robert mentioned Dr. Harrison can expedite everything if we clarify the urgency. We could have outcomes by Monday. That evening, I met with Jessica and Detective Washington to examine the recording. What we'd captured was even more condemning than I'd anticipated. Ms. Parker, this is textbook medical deception, Detective Washington stated after listening to the complete appointment. Dr. Harrison diagnosed you with cognitive impairment before he even conducted the examination. The queries he posed Sophia were leading, created to elicit specific responses that would support a predetermined conclusion. Jessica had her own evidence to include. I was in the workplace all day as the temporary nurse. Dr. Harrison met with Robert Coleman for an hour before your appointment. They examined what diagnosis Robert required and discussed how to document it appropriately. What's the subsequent step? Tomorrow, Dr. Harrison will contact with your examination outcomes and recommend instant intervention. Robert Coleman will file emergency competency documentation with the court. Daniel will endorse the trust documentation as your legal guardian, and you'll be positioned in a care institution for your own security, and then within 7 months you'll die of medical complications that are perfectly explainable for someone with traumatic brain injury. Detective Washington opened her laptop and showed me a timeline she'd constructed. Robert Coleman's previous targets all followed this precise design. Medical diagnosis, competency hearing, financial transfer, convenient death. I stared at the display, observing the names and photographs of 7 individuals who died because they'd trusted their families to secure them instead of steal from them. Detective Washington, do we have adequate evidence to apprehend them? We're close, but we require one additional component. We need to capture them in the action of filing fraudulent medical reports or perjuring themselves in court. How do we accomplish that? She smiled with the type of satisfaction that indicated we were about to reverse the situation on individuals who believed they were more intelligent than the legal system. Tomorrow morning, you're going to astonish everyone by appearing at Robert Coleman's workplace with your own attorney and your own medical authority. We're going to compel them to commit perjury in front of witnesses, and then we're going to observe their complete operation disintegrate. But initially, I was going to contact Daniel and Sophia and inform them precisely what I contemplated of their strategy to murder me for money. Because if I was going down fighting. And I was going to guarantee they comprehended precisely who they'd attempted to manipulate. After 67 years on this planet, it was time to demonstrate my family what occurred when you misinterpreted a mother's affection for a mother's vulnerability. Friday morning at 9:15, I entered Robert Coleman's workplace with Charles Bennett, Dr. Michael Reynolds from the State Medical Licensing Board, Detective Washington, and a court stenographer. The expression on Robert's face, when our minor parade entered his expensive workplace, was worth the risk of everything I was about to accomplish. Ms. Parker, what's occurring here? Robert, I contemplated we should discuss your trust documentation with some additional specialists present. Daniel and Sophia were already positioned at Robert's conference table, encircled by legal papers, and wearing matching expressions of predatory satisfaction that transformed into panic as they realized their meeting had been invaded by law enforcement. Mom, what are all these individuals accomplishing here? Daniel stood up, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and what I was starting to identify as the fear of someone whose criminal scheme was collapsing. Daniel, I'd prefer you to encounter Dr. Michael Reynolds. He's here to discuss the medical evaluation that Dr. Harrison accomplished yesterday. Dr. Reynolds stepped forward with the type of professional authority that made Robert Coleman retreat against his workstation. Mr. Parker, I've examined the medical report that Dr. Harrison filed with the court this morning recommending your mother's instant competency hearing. Sophia became very motionless. Filed this morning, but the brain scans aren't scheduled until this afternoon. Intriguing observation, Dr. Reynolds responded. Because according to Dr. Harrison's report, the brain scans have already been accomplished and display evidence of severe cognitive impairment requiring instant intervention. Robert Coleman cleared his throat nervously. I'm certain there's been some administrative mistake. Dr. Harrison probably misstated his report. Detective Washington opened her folder and distributed several documents across Robert's conference table. Actually, Mr. Coleman, the dates are perfectly precise. Dr. Harrison filed a medical report diagnosing Ms. Parker with severe dementia based on brain scans that were allegedly accomplished last Saturday. That's impossible, Daniel stated. Mom was still in the medical facility last Saturday. Exactly. Which implies Dr. Harrison filed a report based on medical examinations that never occurred, diagnosing a patient he had never evaluated for a condition that doesn't exist. The room became silent except for the gentle tapping of the court stenographer's equipment documenting every term. Charles Bennett produced his own folder and started reading. According to the competency petition filed with the court 3 hours ago, Ms. Parker is experiencing severe dementia, presents a threat to herself and others, and requires instant placement under her son's financial guardianship to secure her $34 million inheritance. Sophia and Daniel exchanged glances like convicts who just heard their death verdict. Furthermore, Detective Washington continued, we have recordings of yesterday's medical appointment displaying Dr. Harrison's examination was conducted specifically to generate documentation for a predetermined diagnosis. I stood up gradually, permitting my voice to carry the complete burden of 67 years' worth of disappointment in individuals who'd mistaken benevolence for foolishness. Daniel, I comprehend about the Coleman siblings' previous targets. I comprehend about the 7 individuals they've murdered for inheritance money. And I comprehend that you married Sophia specifically to obtain access to Beatrice's estate. Mom, you're being paranoid. Sophia and I adore each other. Sophia, inform Daniel about your genuine name. Sophia's composure finally fractured completely. I don't comprehend what you're discussing. Your genuine name is Sophia Coleman, and Robert is your sibling. You're both professional inheritance thieves and Daniel is merely your newest target. Daniel rotated to observe Sophia with an expression of dawning horror. Sophia, is that accurate? Sophia's silence was response adequate. Robert Coleman made one final attempt to regain authority of the situation. Detective Washington, I believe there are some misunderstandings here that we can resolve without involving law enforcement. Actually, Mr. Coleman, we're beyond the stage of misunderstandings. You filed fraudulent medical documentation with the court. Your sibling committed marriage deception. And you've both been conducting surveillance on Ms. Parker without her approval. That's adequate for apprehensions immediately. She nodded to 2 uniformed officers who'd been waiting outside, and they entered the workplace with restraints. Robert Coleman, Sophia Coleman. You're under apprehension for conspiracy to commit deception, elder mistreatment, and filing fraudulent medical reports. As the officers started reading them their privileges, Sophia rotated to Daniel with the initial genuine emotion I'd observed from her. Daniel, I desire you to comprehend that none of this was intended to harm you. You were intended to be our collaborator in this. Daniel stared at her like a man who just discovered that his complete reality was a carefully constructed falsehood. Collaborator in what? In murdering your mother for her money. The terms lingered in the atmosphere like toxic gas, and I observed my son's face as he finally comprehended the complete scope of what he'd been drawn into. He hadn't merely been greedy and self-centered. He'd been the unknowing accessory in a strategy to murder his mother. Mom, he whispered. And for the initial occasion in years, his voice sounded like the little boy who'd once come to me with scraped knees and fractured playthings. Daniel, we'll discuss this subsequently. Currently, I require you to comprehend that you have a choice to create. What choice? You can continue to be the type of man who discards his mother for money, or you can become the type of man who acknowledges he was mistaken and attempts to rectify it. Detective Washington stepped forward with her final component of evidence. Mr. Parker, we have documentation that you were in communication with Robert Coleman for weeks before your aunt's death was publicly declared. We have recordings of your medical appointment yesterday, where you deceived about your mother's psychological condition. And we have surveillance footage of you examining your mother's residence for security weaknesses. Daniel looked around the room like a man who just realized he was standing in quicksand. Detective Washington, I pledge I didn't comprehend they were preparing to injure her. I believed we were merely attempting to secure the inheritance from taxes and legal complications. That's precisely what they desired you to contemplate. But your selections over the subsequent hours will establish whether you're prosecuted as a target of their scheme, or as a co-conspirator in attempted murder. After Robert and Sophia were guided away in restraints, Daniel and I sat solitary in Robert's workplace while Charles Bennett managed the documentation that would undo all the legal documents they'd attempted to ensnare me with. Mom, I'm apologetic. For what specifically? For being a terrible son. For being greedy. For permitting them to utilize me to injure you. I observed this man who'd been my greatest pride and my most profound disappointment, and I realized that this was the moment that would define our relationship for whatever time we had remaining. Daniel, I forgive you for being greedy. I forgive you for being self-centered. I even forgive you for not visiting me in the medical facility. But I will never forgive you for being prepared to steal from me without even having the bravery to accomplish it personally. You concealed behind Sophia and Robert because you desired my money, but you didn't desire to assume accountability for seizing it. Daniel was weeping currently. The type of tears that originate from finally observing yourself clearly and not appreciating what you discover. What can I accomplish to resolve this? You can commence by testifying against the Coleman siblings. You can assist us guarantee they never accomplish this to another family. And then I contemplated Beatrice's letter, about her hope that I would secure what she'd constructed, about the accountability that accompanied $34 million and a second opportunity at existence. Then you can demonstrate that you've learned the distinction between being provided something and earning it. 7 months later, I was seated in the federal courthouse observing Robert and Sophia Coleman receive life sentences for 7 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Daniel sat beside me wearing a suit that had belonged to his father and an expression of someone who'd invested half a year learning what it signified to confront the consequences of your selections. The district attorney, Elena Rodriguez, had constructed an airtight case utilizing the evidence we'd accumulated, plus testimony from Daniel about the Coleman siblings' techniques. It materialized that Robert and Sophia had been operating their inheritance scheme for 6 years, targeting solitary widows and elderly parents whose grown children were desperate enough to participate in murder for money. Your Honor, District Attorney Rodriguez stated during her concluding statement, the defendants didn't merely steal money from their targets. They stole dignity, trust, and the fundamental security that families are intended to provide for their most susceptible members. Robert Coleman displayed no regret during his sentencing. Even confronting life in incarceration, he maintained the arrogant confidence of someone who believed he was more intelligent than everyone else in the space. Sophia, on the other hand, fractured down completely when the judge read her sentence, finally displaying genuine emotion after months of calculated performance. Daniel had testified against them with the type of detailed honesty that originates from someone who's finally decided to cease deceiving himself. His testimony had been devastating, not merely legally, but personally, as he described how they'd manipulated his greed and bitterness into a preparedness to betray his mother. The most challenging portion, he'd stated from the witness platform, was realizing that I'd been furious at my mother for not providing me the existence I believed I merited when I'd never actually earned anything for myself. After the sentencing, Daniel and I exited the courthouse collectively. And for the initial occasion in years, I felt like I was walking with my son instead of dragging him along behind me. Mom, what occurs currently? Currently we determine what we're going to accomplish with the remainder of our lives. Over the previous 7 months, Daniel had been residing in a modest apartment and working as a construction manager, the initial honest occupation he'd maintained for more than a year. He'd also been attending therapy sessions with Dr. Chen, attempting to comprehend how 36 years of entitlement had nearly transformed him into an accessory to murder. I've been contemplating what you mentioned about earning things versus being provided them. And I desire to earn your esteem back. I desire to become someone you can be proud of again. I observed my son, 43 years old and finally posing the correct queries, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope for his future. Daniel, I have a proposal for you. We drove to the workplaces of Lakeside Community Foundation, a philanthropic organization I'd been investigating for months. Beatrice's $34 million was more money than any solitary individual required, and I'd been contemplating how to utilize it in a manner that would respect her memory while securing other families from predators like the Coleman siblings. Ms. Parker, stated Maria Gonzalez, the Foundation's executive director. We're honored that you're contemplating establishing a fund with us. I decided to generate the Beatrice Walsh Memorial Fund for Elder Security, a foundation that would provide legal assistance for older adults confronting financial mistreatment, assistance for families managing inheritance deception, and instructional initiatives to assist individuals identify the indications of estate preparation frauds. Daniel is going to assist me operate it, I stated, observing his face as he realized what I was providing him. Mom, are you serious? I'm serious about providing you the opportunity to demonstrate you've transformed. The foundation will compensate you a moderate salary for honest labor securing individuals from the type of criminals you almost became. Daniel was quiet for an extended moment. And I could observe him processing what this signified, not merely financially but morally. What if I'm not competent enough? What if I ruin this, too? Then you'll learn from your errors and attempt again. But Daniel, this occasion you'll be working to assist individuals instead of injure them. The Beatrice Walsh Memorial Fund initiated 4 months later, with an preliminary endowment of $26 million. I retained $8 million for my own retirement and independence because I'd learned that possessing your own resources was the optimal security against individuals who might mistake your generosity for susceptibility. Daniel immersed himself in the labor with the intensity of someone compensating for misplaced time. He coordinated with law enforcement organizations, created instructional resources, and individually advised families who'd been targeted by inheritance frauds. It materialized that his background as an almost target made him uniquely qualified to assist other individuals identify manipulation before it was too delayed. Ms. Parker, Detective Washington stated during one of our quarterly advisory committee gatherings, the Foundation has assisted us prevent 19 inheritance deception instances in the previous 7 months. That's 19 families who still possess their parents and their dignity. I looked around the conference table at the attorneys, social employees, and law enforcement officers who'd committed to securing older adults from financial predators. And I felt the type of satisfaction that originates from constructing something significant instead of merely accumulating wealth. But the most significant transformation was in my relationship with Daniel. Not because he'd become flawless. He was still learning how to be an adult at 43, but because he'd finally assumed accountability for his selections and was working to become someone deserving of trust. Mom, he stated one evening as we examined foundation requests. Do you believe Father would be proud of what we're accomplishing? I contemplated my late husband, about the man who'd adored Daniel despite his imperfections and worried about his character. I believe Father would be proud that you finally determined how to utilize your intelligence for something other than taking shortcuts. And you? Are you proud of me? It was a query he'd been posing in various methods since his testimony against the Coleman siblings. And finally, I could respond it honestly. Daniel, I'm proud of who you're becoming, and that's adequate for currently. 7 months ago, I'd inherited $34 million and nearly lost my existence to my own son's greed. Today, I was seated in my own foundation's workplace, observing Daniel coordinate with federal agents to close down another inheritance deception scheme, and feeling the type of contentment that originates from surviving your most severe nightmare and constructing something superior from the wreckage. Beatrice had been correct about one reality. Daniel had required to learn that achievement wasn't something that occurred to other individuals. He merely required to learn it the challenging method in a federal courthouse, confronting the consequences of almost becoming a killer for money. But she'd been mistaken about something else. She'd underestimated both of us. I wasn't merely the woman who'd never requested anything from her. I was the woman who'd counterattacked when everything was at stake. And Daniel wasn't merely the greedy great-nephew she'd worried about. He was the man who'd discovered the bravery to testify against his co-conspirators and invest the remainder of his existence securing the individuals he'd almost assisted annihilate. As I secured the Foundation workplace that evening and observed Daniel drive away to his modest apartment in his practical Toyota, I realized that some inheritances aren't about money at all. They're about wisdom, bravery, and the resilience to become superior than the individuals who raised you believed you could be. And occasionally, if you're highly fortunate, they're about second opportunities for both mothers and sons who finally determined what genuinely matters when everything else is eliminated. The greatest inheritance isn't money, but the wisdom to use it wisely. If this narrative connected with you, please like this video and subscribe to Winds of Thought for additional content. Your assistance assists us distribute these significant realities.